Lugan. I'm a professor of anthropology at UC Merced, also a member of California's Central Valley Journey for Justice. Just some logistics. The restrooms are in the corner, in the back. And we're going to try to stick with the program as best as we can. And
the other people that I want to recognize that also, if they're here, I know that we've kind of been running errands and all, but there's some groups from UC Merced that have joined us in this collaborative. Merced at UC Merced, are you in the house? Somewhere, all right. Okay. Then we have the Student Affairs. And
that's the Office of Student Affairs. It's been a big sponsor for us. Thank you, UC Merced Office of Student Affairs.
Right, and Associated Students of the University of California also. Want to thank the Unitarian Universalists, which Mary Ann Reynolds and a few of the members, there she is. All right, thank you, Mary. The other members that are here. We have also Healthy House within a Match Coalition, which has also assisted with interpreters. And Marta Acevedo is here, representing that group too. Thank you. American Civil Liberties Union will be coming. I do believe they're kind of they're coming from out of town, so we'll be letting you know when they're here. And finally, we have the Social Action Team of the United Methodist Church, where it is that we're meeting. Patty Jones, unfortunately, was not able to be here, but Dave Headland, very appreciative that Dave Headland is here, also with us, to give us some support there.
So we're going to start with our first presentation. To give us some perspective on the history of immigration, we've invited Professor Mario Cifuentes to share some information with us. So without further ado, Mario. Professor Cifuentes.
I'm going to give you a real brief overview of Mexican immigration. I realize that this immigration issue has more to do than just with Mexicans, but it all has its very own particular history. So when we talk about Mexican immigration or immigration from Mexico, we have to go back to 1848 and the end of the Mexican-American War. And so the reason that we're talking about Mexican immigration to the United States is because John Calhoun wins this debate. Now the debate after the Mexican-American War is whether or not the United States is going to take all of Mexico or just part of Mexico. And ultimately it decides that it wants only part of Mexico and the part that is least populated. And the reason it wants only the least populated part of it is because of John Calhoun and the people who follow John Calhoun in the Senate, who claim that the United States should be and is and always has been and always will be a government of the white race. And so it decides ultimately that it doesn't want the more populated, heavily populated parts of Mexico, while other members of Congress want all of Mexico, form an organization or a group called the All Mexico Movement. Ultimately, racism saves Mexico from being part of the United States in its entirety. Right? So you have John Calhoun who protests against the idea of incorporating Indians into the fabric of American society. So they take only the part of the U.S. that is mostly sparsely populated, that is now what we call today the U.S. Southwest. John Calhoun famously says, we already have a Negro problem, we don't need an Indian. After the Mexican-American War, you have this problem with defining the border. Now we tend to think of borders as being very static, solid things, but in reality, they're a very malleable, contested space. And so the Joint Boundary Commission in 1850 sets out to try to map the border between the United States and Mexico. Now, they run into a number of different problems. One is that there are no actual accurate maps of the area, and so the maps that do exist are known to have inconsistencies and are known to be inaccurate. And so this Joint Boundary Commission between Mexico and the United States sets out to try to map this area here. The other major problem that they run into is that the Apaches don't think either government should be able to map the area that they live in. And so as the Boundary Commission is trying to literally map the area, they're undergoing a series of attacks by raiding Apaches that make it incredibly difficult for them to map the southwest borderlands. And so ultimately, no, keep going, I'll point out. And so ultimately what happens is that they give up, and they draw a line on the map, and they decide, okay, this is what the borderlands is at. They don't have the equipment, they don't have the funding. The U.S. Commission runs out of funding within the first year of trying to map the boundary. And so in the 1850s all the way to the 1920s, 1930s, the border still remains a very malleable thing. And in fact, guys like this is a guy named Henry A. Crabb, start leading filibustering expeditions. Anybody know what filibustering means? So filibustering are unauthorized military excursions into a foreign country. And so Americans on the U.S. side of the border, throughout the 1850s all the way to the 1900s, are launching military expeditions trying to attack towns and cities in Mexico, believing that they are the rightful heirs to the land on the southern side of the border. And so it's not until Crabb's expedition is turned away by a Sonoran militia of government, local people, indigenous peasants, that ultimately turn back Crabb and massacre a group of, or I should say capture and execute Crabb's expedition, that Americans stopped trying to take over more land in Mexico. So it gives you a sense of how the area is contested well into the 20th century after the Mexican-American War. Okay, now? This is what the border looked like at that area, right? So the Joint Boundary Commission would set up these piles of rocks to designate the space between the U.S. and Mexican border. And of course, this is a very temporal marker. And so Indians, Mexicans, Americans would knock over these border markers and try to fudge where the border was in order to make, obviously for the Apaches, they felt that neither government had a right to make an indication of where the boundary was, and so they would knock them down. For Mexicans who crossed back and forth across the border regularly, they knocked them down. Americans who were trying to make excursions into Mexico knocked them down. And so essentially this border has always been challenged since its very inception, since the moment that it was created. So eventually they try to do this, right? And they go to a more solid structure. But those eventually start ending up with bullet holes, get knocked down. And eventually those also aren't enough to where they start creating these barriers to the marks. And so you can see, between the 1850s and 1920s, you have a number of different people who are contesting even the existence of the border, let alone where it's going to be. Now, what's interesting about the Border Patrol and the border situation is that it has its first state-sanctioned sort of presence in the border has two goals. One is to tax goods that are moving back and forth between Mexico and the United States. Now, this is a joint effort by Mexico and the United States. Both of them rely heavily on taxation and on importing of goods. And so the first thing that gets set up along the border are customs houses. And that's what they're mostly concerned about. They're concerned about contraband. They're concerned about things coming in that they can't tax. Right? So first and foremost, the making of the border is the making of a capitalist structure. Right? It needs to be able to tax the things that are coming in and out, right, in order to line its coffers. The second reason that a border patrol is created, or that the border is becoming solidified, is because of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. So the purpose of the border patrol initially is not to keep out Mexicans from the United States, it's to keep out Chinese from the United States. And so, since the Chinese were excluded from immigrating to the United States in 1882, there was a long history of Chinese immigrating to Mexico, learning Spanish, learning how to dress in traditional clothing, and then literally just walking across the border into the United States. So this image here comes from Harper's Weekly, which gives you an indication of the first illegal immigrants, quote unquote, right? The first undocumented immigrants are Chinese immigrants to the United States. And just like today, there was also an epidemic of them dying in the desert in the 1800s, the 1900s, trying to cross into the United States. Of course, the other major movement that happens for Mexican immigration along the border is the Mexican Revolution. Now, Porfirio Diaz, who had been a dictator for Mexico for nearly 30 years, had really his efforts have really sort of run their course, and the Mexican Revolution sends millions and millions of Mexicans across the border into the United States. And the border becomes an issue because of men like the Flores Maragon brothers and Pancho Villa, right? The border starts to become an arena, a space where the Mexican Revolution is being fought. between centralists and federalists, between revolutionaries and the dictatorship. And ultimately, the United States provides a safe haven for a lot of these revolutionaries, like the Flores Magón brothers. They organize a newspaper called La Regeneración. That's a syndical anarchist paper. They start to launch attacks on Diaz's forces from Mexico into the United States. And ultimately, the Flores Magón brothers are also persecuted by the United States, and they end up in jail in Leavenworth, Kansas, in the federal penitentiary for their revolutionary activities. But the border becomes more solidified during this era. This is the first time that we see a fence go up in the Mexican-U.S. borderlands, and it has a lot to do with this revolutionary activities and growing fears among Americans that the revolution is going to spill over into the United States. And eventually it does, right? Villa eventually does start to launch attacks against American trains and things like that during the Mexican Revolution. Partly because he feels slighted by Wilson, who initially supports the revolution and then switches sides to Diaz's, to Carranza's forces, right? So you have a split here where the border starts to become a battleground. So there's literally revolutionary battle being fought over the border between El Paso and Juarez and other border cities. And so this is the first time that we start to see a militarization of the U.S.-Mexican border. So again, during the Porfiriato, the other thing that we have is a heavy investment of American dollars into Mexico. And so while we talk about, sort of military imperialism, we also have what's happening here in economic imperialism. So by the time the Porfiriato ends, the United States owns 60 to 70% of all goods in Mexico. So they own the railroads, they own the mines, they own basically anything that's sort of producing wealth in Mexico. The United States owns about 70% of that. And so in order to get those goods, the ore, the copper, the other sort of goods that are being grown in Mexico, the Porfiriato builds railroads all throughout Mexico to go north, right, to take all the goods north. Now, what's not anticipated or what's not expected is that this is also a good way for people to get north. Right? So again, just like we have today in the United States or in the world, I should say, we want a free flow of capital, but we don't want a free flow of people. Right? So it's okay for goods to move back across the border, but when people do it, it becomes a problem. But that's a very long historical problem. The Americans and the Mexicans wanted the goods to go in and out. And I say the Mexicans, I mean the dictatorship, wanted the goods to go in and out, but they didn't want the people to go in and out. But ultimately what happens, as you can see, is that wherever those railroads are, people are immigrating from. So this is a map of the birthplace of Mexican migrants to Los Angeles. And so you can see these squares are places where 150 or more Mexicans have left their home and are now living in Los Angeles. Okay, this is in the turn of the century, 1900s or so. Alright, so if you can go back one slide real quick. So as you can see, right, wherever these marks are, wherever these train stations are, people come from. So obviously, look, 1 to 4 people are born in Yucatan, right, that are coming to Los Angeles during the 1900s because they don't have easy access to the railroads. And so the railroads have a dramatic transformation on local economies, right? Whatever economy the railroad was going through, that became ultimately a sending community in Mexico. Well, I should go back one more time. So I should also add that those same railroads that bring people from Mexico to the United States are eventually the same railroads that send people back during the Great Depression. And so in the 1930s, when the Great Depression hits, obviously we have an issue where Hoover begins to attack Mexicans and blaming Mexicans for the economic deterioration of the United States. So again, something that has a long historical trajectory. When economies fail, immigrants get the blame. Okay? So the same thing happens in the 1930s, where when the Great Depression happens, we have a repatriation of Mexicans and Mexican Americans. And so the local governments, the local county officials, et cetera, start to believe the rhetoric that Mexicans are ultimately responsible for the Great Depression, and they start to organize large-scale train lists to take people back to Mexico. And so they were forcing people to go back to Mexico on these trains, whether they're American citizens or not. And so then we know that, for instance, in Los Angeles, 60% of the people who were deported during the Great Depression were American citizens. And as a matter of fact, LA County, as about, I think in March of this year, finally issued an apology to the family members and to the people who were deported illegally in the 1930s. So we have a couple of things here, right? Up until we have a very fluid border, we have a need for labor that develops in the late 1800s. When that labor is no longer needed in the Great Depression, we send that labor back. And in the 1940s, when we have a labor shortage in World War II, we have an attempt to bring the workers back again. So the Merced program was what we call a guest worker program. It was a bilateral agreement between Mexico and the United States, where Mexico would send workers to the United States to work ostensibly in the agricultural field, with the understanding that when that contract ran out, they would go back to Mexico. And so between 1942 and 1964, there are 4.6 million contracts issued for bracero workers. Okay? Now, the program was supposed to be during the war, 42 to 44 roughly, and the idea was that it was supposed to serve a labor shortage that was caused by World War II. But bracero workers came under the auspices of guaranteed contracts, of guaranteed housing, of adequate wages, and when they got to the United States, they often found that that was not the case. Right? They didn't have the housing that they were promised, they didn't have the wages that they were promised, and were essentially an exploitable labor force. And so the farmers grew attached to this very cheap source of labor and continued to renew the program well into the 1960s. And so although, again, we argued in the 1940s that we were bringing guest workers, Mexican guest workers, to alleviate the labor shortage, what really happens is that farmers and agribusiness get attached to cheap labor and continue to renew the program, like I said, until '64. So what would happen is that different cities in Mexico would be designated as reception centers. Now, when the program starts, those reception centers are in the south and in the central Mexico. That gives the Mexican government a lot of control over who gets the contractor workers and what kind of wages they get, etc. But as the program develops, those reception centers keep moving farther and farther north. And so what happened is that on the Mexican side, these men would pay a bribe, right, to Mexican officials to be allowed to go to the reception centers. At the reception centers, American contractors or contractors for American businesses would come and inspect the braceros. And so what we have here is part of the inspection process. The first inspection process that takes place are these tuberculosis x-rays. So again, there's a long history of the assumption that immigrants carry disease, and the assumption that especially Mexicans in particular are dirty, and so there needs to be a tuberculosis examination that happens at the border crossing. The second thing we have here is what we call the hands test. Right? So what they would do is that American workers, right, or American farmers wanted people who had labor experience. And so they would go through one by one and show their hands to an immigrant, to a labor contractor inspector. And if the person lacked calluses or didn't have rough hands, they were rejected from entering the bracero program. Okay? Here we literally have a man, the man is grabbing the buttocks of a bracero to check his build, to see if he's strong, to see if he's well built. So we have essentially like a 1940s slave auction, right? We have people going through, I mean that's a bit of hyperbole, but you get the point, right? They're going through inspecting the bodies, investigating the bodies to see if the bodies are up to snuff, if it's what American farmers want. And finally, the last and probably most degrading aspect, the men would strip naked in front of mixed gender audiences and then go into these rooms and be sprayed down with DDT. Again, with the assumption that somehow Mexicans are dirty, right? And that they needed to be clean and quarantined the same way a cattle would. So the bracero program, like I said, lasts well into the 1960s. There's over 4.6 million contracts issued, anywhere between 2 to 3 million people who came over during the bracero program between those 20 years. Now, the bracero program has the effects, has a couple of effects. One, it sort of shapes the contours of future migration. So for instance, the book that I'm writing is about immigration to Oregon, for instance. There was very little immigration of Mexicans to Oregon before the Merced program. The Merced program was the first instance of mass migration of Mexicans to the Pacific Northwest. And after that, Mexicans started to come regularly because of the connections that Merced's made. So it has that effect. It also has the effect of creating illegal immigration. Now, when I say what it means, what I say by creating illegal immigration, on the one hand, we have undocumented people who are crossing, who get rejected at Merced centers, who don't have the money to pay the bribes, etc., start to cross into the United States without papers. The other way that we have undocumented immigration being spurred by the Merced program is the Mercedos who got to the United States and figured out that they were being paid crap as compared to what they were supposed to be being paid, would do what they call skip out on contracts. So they would leave their contracts, go to another farmer that would pay them more, and by process become undocumented. And so this is what we have in the 1950s. In the 1950s, we have a great scare around undocumented immigrants that is really kind of brought about by the existence of the Merced program. Now, the INS, the Border Patrol, has a little bit of an image problem here, right? In the 1950s, we still have sort of a relatively benign attitude towards immigrants. We have issues with how many immigrants are here, but at the same time, the Americans also, at least in popular culture, accept the notion that these are working class, poor people, peasants, who are coming over here only to feed their families. And so that's still kind of the general belief in American mainstream media. And so the INS, in many ways, is sort of the bad guy here, right? They're over there deporting people, they're hurting people's families, they're hurting people's chances, and the INS knows that it has a problem. And so it begins sort of this large-scale public relations campaign in which it starts to argue that ultimately what we're doing, right, is freeing these enslaved people from agribusiness by sending them back to Mexico. And on the flip side of that, the farmers start to respond with their own political campaign saying, we're just trying to help these poor peasants, right, that are trying to get work and survive. So they have this public debate going on about the image of border control and what the image of border control is supposed to be. At the same time, there's also a growing political group that wants a crackdown on undocumented immigration, and this starts to happen in the early 1950s with a proposed operation called Operation Cloudburst. Now, Operation Cloudburst, the leaders of the INS and the Border Patrol met with a man named General Swing, who was a general in the U.S. military, who wanted to implement military-style tactics to controlling Mexican immigration. And so it came up with these sort of four attacks, or four theories, four strategies for controlling immigration at the border. One was to seal the border. They wanted to put a military presence on the border and begin to seal it and build fences all the way across the border. So that border fence thing, again, has a long historical trajectory. In the 1950s, there's an attempt to militarize the border this way. The second was containment. And so they understood that you couldn't control all the border, but there would be what they call special mobile task units that would go around the border and start picking up different border crossers. And third was they also started to set up road checks and checkpoints. The idea was they would set up road checks and checkpoints on all freeways going north of the border. Okay, so that was the second step. The third strategy for Operation Cloudburst was raids, right? Going to communities that they called mopping up. They would go into communities, into churches, into neighborhoods that they knew were Mexican or had ethnic Mexicans in them, and try to clear out or mop up the rest of the undocumented immigrants. And finally, they also had issues with having they also knew that when they deported people to the other side of the border, they would simply just cross again in a few days. And so what they started to do is to implement airlifts and train lifts where they would take people far into the interior of Mexico and leave them there regardless of where they came from. Okay? So under that idea, they were going to be able to stop undocumented immigration. So this whole strategy was laid out, this whole plot was laid out to have the National Guard and the U.S. military come in and implement Operation Cloudburst. But ultimately they ran into a little problem called posse comitatus, which was a law that forbade the U.S. military to be on U.S. grounds in policing actions unless specified by Congress. And so Congress is unwilling to give the military in the 1950s that opportunity, that power to try to implement Operation Cloudburst. So what they do instead is give the INS general swing. And so General Swing then starts to implement all of these policies when he becomes the director, the commissioner of the Border Patrol. Okay? That's what comes to be known as Operation Wetback. Now, historically, we've thought about Operation Wetback as a large-scale military campaign, a large-scale military-style deportation campaign, but it's probably better understood as a public relations campaign. So the strategies that Operation Wetback put in place were in operation since the 1950s. Right? Since 1950, when Operation Wetback takes place is 1954. And so General Swing announces that we're going to partake in this new, what do you call it, sort of inventive, novel approach to immigration and immigration control, and we're going to quote-unquote conquer the border. And so Release is essentially this large public relations campaign where he has massive amounts of INS officials come from Canada, come from Florida, come from all over the country, concentrated them in the Southwest, and went on about a 2-month rampage on the immigrant community. And so within that 2 months, they made something like 30,000 to 40,000 arrests and deportations during that 2 months. So he invites newspaper reporters, he invites the media to come and follow him around where these raids are taking place, and it makes for great newspaper headlines. Right? Mexican immigrants are running through restaurants, they're running through fields, they're doing all these things where essentially they're making great television. The other thing that they do is they start to send teams into farmers' fields. And they have a discussion with the farmer and says, look, either you legalize these people through the Merced program, or we're going to sit here and wait and raid your fields every day. And so they start to numerically reduce the number of undocumented immigrants, even though the people who are in the fields are technically the same people. Right? So when we talk about illegal immigrants versus undocumented immigrants versus documented immigrants, we're often talking about the same people depending on which day of the week we're talking about. Right? So it's not an actual deportation campaign per se. Right? So we have, in 1954, Operation Wetback has since then claimed a great success. You have proponents of military-style campaigns today pointing to Operation Wetback saying, look at how effective it was in 1954 because we deported 1.075 million immigrants during Operation Wetback. But the reality of it is, most of them were just what they called drying out. They would legalize them through the Merced program, tie them to the poor wages, tie them to a particular grower, and the INS, their hands were clean. They were done. So we can see what this happens in 1956 when immediately after Operation Wetback, General Swing then cuts a huge chunk of the INS officers and replaces them with 73 two-man teams. So essentially we have like 146 people patrolling the border now, where they had thousands of agents just a few years before. So what's going to happen to the numbers of deported aliens? It's going to go down. You only have 140 people now to patrol the entire border. And so the number goes down to 72,000 deportable aliens within 2 years. And so General Swing says, we've conquered the border. We've won. You people said we had an immigration problem. We fixed it. Okay? So this is a very tricky little organization we're talking about when we're saying about the INS. Right? So the problem happens, well, here's a couple of things. One, during this era of Operation Wetback, we have the solidification of what we call a mindset of migration control. Now this is a quote from a migration officer, a Border Patrol officer in the 19th, demonstrating to you that same person could be documented 1 week and not documented the other. So what changes in a person's aura right? All of a sudden makes them an undocumented person that you can know. So again, the politics of Arizona's SB 1070 law have a long history. People felt this mindset of migration control as early as the 1950s about who is undocumented and who isn't undocumented. The other problem that the INS now has is that if they've won the border, right, if they've conquered the border, all of a sudden Congress is saying, well, since you've conquered the border, you don't need all that money we've sent you. So we're going to start cutting back on INS funding. So General Swingman testifies before Congress and says, well, wait a second, we have won the border, but we're dealing with a very tricky group of people here. They're no longer jumping fences and swimming across the channels. Now they have fake papers. Okay? Now they have fraudulent documents. So we need more money to patrol and police the fraudulent papers that these people might have. So there's no evidence that immigration slowed down. There's no evidence that more people were being deported. There's no evidence that people are using fraudulent papers. But for the INS, in order for the INS to maintain its funding at its current level, or I should say at its current level at the time, it needed another bad guy. And that bad guy became fraudulent citizens, people who were using fake papers. At the same time, they also still had an image problem, right? They were dealing with deporting people who were simply trying to feed their families in the public imagination. So they had to start changing the way that they talked to the public. And so they stopped using the term wetback, they stopped using the term undocumented immigrant, and they began to associate themselves with the FBI. Now, they contracted the FBI to do background checks on all the people that they had arrested, all the people that were deported, and those with a criminal record were no longer to be referred to as undocumented immigrants or illegal aliens. They were to be documented as criminal aliens. Right? So it didn't matter what the actual violation was, whether it was a DUI, whether it was a felony or a minor misdemeanor or whatever. Any of the immigrants that had a criminal record were to be referred to as criminal aliens. Now, the statistics that we have indicate to us that out of all the deportable aliens in the United States at that time, the FBI had 3 in the entire country per day that qualified as criminal aliens. So this strategy wasn't going to work. So they had to come up with another term. They said, okay, instead of saying undocumented immigrant, we have to start calling them border violators. Right? So even if you had no criminal record, even if you had no, you didn't qualify as a criminal alien, you were no longer referred to as an undocumented immigrant, you were now a border violator. And so there's this rhetorical shift that happens between quote-unquote wetbacks to criminals. Okay? Finally, we have sort of the drug control era. Now, the drug trade is a very interesting thing in Mexico. First, during World War II, the majority of opium and the majority of marijuana that came into the United States came from the Middle East and Europe. Now, World War II obviously closed the channels for illicit opium and illicit marijuana. And so for the first time, you see Mexico becoming a producer of both of those drugs. Now, what most historians won't tell you is the United States encouraged the growth of opium and marijuana in Mexico to deal with the shortages of World War II. And so the Mexican government, or the U.S. government, went to Mexico and encouraged them to grow opium for morphine, for soldiers, and for the war effort in World War II. And also encouraged them to grow marijuana for hemp, right? To grow hemp for ropes and fibers, etc. during World War II. Now, after World War II was over, that channel to the Middle East and to Europe opened back up again. The American government went back to Mexico and said, okay, stop doing that. Clearly that doesn't happen, right? Clearly people say, well, we're actually kind of making a lot of money doing this. We're not going to stop growing opium and marijuana. And so, all of a sudden, the INS has another reason to exist. Right? All of a sudden, the INS can say, well, see, not only are we law enforcement officials trying to stop criminal aliens from coming in here, we're also DEA agents trying to stop drugs from coming in to the United States. And so the INS continues to sort of reinvent reasons for why it should have this bloated budget that it has, that it develops in the 1950s, and hasn't sunk since. It's been going up and up and up and up. So finally, the end of the immigration era, the end of the wetback era is the 1950s, 1960s, and we have essentially a trickle of Mexican immigration into the United States during the 1960s. The major reason for that is what we call, or what historians have called the Mexican miracle. And so the Mexican miracle is an economic platform or an economic policy that arises out of Mexico in the post-World War II era called import, substitution, industrialization. Now the idea behind ISI is that instead of importing goods and manufactured goods from the United States and other places, we need to build an economy of goods that Mexicans produce. And so they put incredibly high tariffs on American products and other products coming into the United States in an effort to make Mexican products competitive. And it works. There's a 7% growth per year in the Mexican economy, and that starts to have a tremendous effect. And it looks like for the first time, Mexico's economy is going to enter sort of a first world economy. Couple that with the OPEC embargo, and people are familiar with the OPEC embargo, right? The Middle East, the oil-producing nations of the Middle East and Central Asia placed an embargo on the United States for their interference in the Egyptian-Israeli war, which causes gas prices and oil shortages, and gas prices to go up and oil shortages in the United States. Now, the United States turns to Mexico for its oil at that era, and so oil shoots through the roof in Mexico. That also contributes to the Mexican economy and the growth of the Mexican economy in the 1970s. In '76, that oil embargo ends, and the Mexican oil prices crash. And so all of a sudden, Mexico owes a whole bunch of money for money that it borrowed against its future oil sales, and at the same time, the United States raises its interest rates on the loans that it provided Mexico. So Mexico suffers a peso crash in 1982, which gives room to a group of economists known as the Chicago Boys. The Chicago Boys are a group of Latin American Latin American economists studying at the University of Chicago under Milton Friedman, who are espousing the new idea of neoliberal economies. Neoliberalism, free markets, free trade, etc., etc. They're known as científicos in Mexico. So with the installment of new neoliberal policies that come to be called structural adjustment programs, which I think David's going to talk about in more detail, the Mexican government takes a huge hit, and in the 1970s, once again, we start to see a rise in undocumented immigration to the United States from 50, or where there's 100,000 people that are apprehended in 1968 by the INS. And by 1972, there's 500,000 people who are being apprehended in the United States. So you see, what I'm trying to get at here is that the economic conditions in Mexico are what forces people to migrate. Right? It doesn't matter how many borders you build or how many walls you build or what kind of policies you have. If the economic situation is bad in Mexico, people are going to come try and find work. And that's just historically what's been true, and I think will continue to be true. So that's my time. And I think David is up next, and he'll talk to you a little bit about NAFTA and how NAFTA fits into the neoliberal policies of the Mexican government of the United States.
Awesome. Thank you.
So to begin with, looking at what's happening today, right now, immigration raids and enforcement actions and the kind of hysteria that goes with them, they're sweeping through the country. Today, migrants have become criminals. You know, if you look at the way migrants and people without papers were treated 20 years ago, for instance, when people were caught by the Border Patrol or by the then INS, most people were allowed to leave voluntarily. Or if they were deported after having been found essentially guilty of an administrative infraction, which is like a ticket. In other words, it's not even a misdemeanor, let alone a felony. But today people are being sent to privately run, what we call privately run detention centers. What is a privately run detention center? I'm sorry?
A prison.
Right, a prison. It's a euphemism for a prison. So, to give you an example of what's filling up these detention centers, 3 years ago, ICE agents raided the agro-processors meatpacking plant in Iowa, and they sent 388 young people from Guatemala to the National Cattle Congress, which is a livestock showground in a town that was about 2 hours away. Just the name of it tells you something about how federal authorities are looking at migrants. And so in the National Cattle Congress, they built this kind of makeshift courtroom. And in that courtroom, these 388 young people went in chains before a judge who had agreed with prosecutors about the plea agreements that they were going to force those people into 5 months before the raid took place. In other words, 5 months before they even knew the names of the people that they were going to pick up. The judge and the prosecutor had already decided what was going to happen to them. So these workers, they had given the company social security numbers that they'd either invented or that belonged to somebody else. And so the judge and the prosecutor told them that they'd be charged with aggravated identity theft, which carries a 2-year jolt in federal prison, and they would also be held in prison until their trial. On the other hand, if they pled guilty to misusing a social security number, they would just serve 5 months in federal prison and be deported immediately afterwards. So you can imagine what those workers chose. So women like Maria Rosala Mejia here were released to care for their children, but they had to wear that ankle bracelet. And they had no way, so they couldn't work. They had no way to pay rent or to buy food. Their husbands or their brothers, if they'd come with them, were in prison or deported. If it hadn't been for St. Brigida's Catholic Church in Postville and the parishioners there, who collected food and found them a house for women to live in, then their kids would have gone homeless and hungry. So that same year, ICE agents raided a factory belonging to a company called Howard Industries in Laurel, Mississippi. And there they sent 481 workers to a privately run detention center, and again releasing 106 women in those ankle bracelets. Patricia Ice, who is the lawyer for the Mississippi Immigrant Rights Alliance, says that this raid was political. So she says they want a mass exodus of immigrants out of the state. The political establishment here is threatened by Mississippi's changing demographics and what the electorate might look like in 20 years. What she means is that African Americans are moving back south because of the closure of the auto plants and the steel mills in the Midwest and the North. And now Mississippi's population, 37% of Mississippi's population are African American people, which is the highest percentage of any state in the United States. Well, immigrants in Mississippi were statistically insignificant 20 years ago. But now they make up about 10% of the population, and the children of people who came as immigrants, either guest workers or undocumented people, who were born in Mississippi, are now getting to be voting age. And so the Black Caucus in the Mississippi State Legislature, which is, that's the people who organized the Mississippi Immigrant Rights Alliance, and the alliance itself, they have a plan, and that is that if you combine the votes of African Americans with immigrants and some unions of progressive white people in Mississippi, you can get rid of Trent Lott and the political establishment that has held power in Mississippi since the end of Reconstruction. You don't think that scares people? So that raid on that plan had a political purpose. That's what she's saying. It was intended to drive a wedge into the heart of that political coalition. In other words, to stop any kind of possibility for change. Now, since the end of the Bush administration, immigration authorities, ICE, John Morton, Jan Napolitano, say that they're going to follow a softer policy, meaning that instead of bringing in people in those black uniforms with the submachine guns into factories, they're going to implement a system for checking the legal status of workers, an electronic database that they call E-Verify. So people who are working with those bad social security numbers are going to get fired. So what have we seen since they started implementing this? Well, 2,000 young women working on sewing machines at the American Apparel factory in Los Angeles got fired. 1,200 people working cleaning buildings in downtown Minneapolis got fired. 475 janitors working in San Francisco's office buildings got fired. 214 people working in a foundry in Berkeley, right next to Emeryville, Pacific Steel Corporation, got fired. You know, looking at those workers, for instance, who got fired this last January at Pacific Steel, because they're pretty local, you know, some of those workers have worked in that foundry for 20 years. And we're not talking about people who are criminals. These are people who are doing what people are supposed to do in our society. In other words, they're working, they're supporting their families, they're stable folks. When the company wanted to cut wages and make those workers pay an unsustainable amount of money for their healthcare system, they and their union went out on strike for a week. So they defended their standards, they defended the wages that they were getting there, they defended the union that they belonged to, which was something that helped all other workers in the East Bay too, who were trying to defend their wages and their health plan too, because they're putting pressure on employers to keep the wages and benefits up. So what then is the purpose of doing this, of this kind of firings and this kind of enforcement? ICE says that they are auditing the 1,654 companies nationwide. So, you know, like Marriott Corporation is a company. Think of how many people are working in the Marriott hotels. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who are getting fired because of this kind of enforcement. So the first question is, you know, we have a recession. What kind of economic recovery program are we talking about here that goes along with firing hundreds of thousands of people? Now these workplace raids, the Bush raids, and the firings, and the E-Verify database, these are all ways of enforcing a part of the law that's called employer sanctions, which is part of the Immigration Reform and Control Act that was passed in 1986, that said for the first time that employers had to check the immigration status of the workers who work for them. Now, a lot of us remember 1986 law, IRGA, as being the amnesty law. So it has some good memories for a lot of folks here. But the reality is that most immigrant rights activists of the 1980s campaigned against that law. Not because we didn't want amnesty, but because we did not want sanctions. Because we knew what the impact that sanctions would have on people. Essentially what that law did was it made it a federal crime for somebody to work if they don't have papers. Now, supposedly, if you listen to the rhetoric in Washington, people say, well, the sanctions were never enforced, meaning that we didn't see a lot of employers getting fined or going to jail because they violated the law. But hundreds of thousands of workers lost their jobs, and nobody even counts them. We don't even know how many people lost their jobs. ICE doesn't even know, I don't think. Nobody keeps track of them because those people don't count. Now, one more. ICE says that this kind of enforcement is targeting employers, this is reading from the ICE website, who says, they say, who are using illegal workers to drive down wages. You know, Mario, when you were making a presentation, you were talking about the rationales for immigration enforcement. It just made me think about this one because the same thing, they just recycle the same rhetoric over and over again. In other words, here we go, here they are again saying, those employers who pay illegal workers substandard wages or force them to endure intolerable working conditions. Well, you think it cured the intolerable working conditions of American Apparel by firing those workers, or did it help those workers get any kind of better conditions? Of course not. And that's not really who ICE is targeting anyway, really. American Apparel actually paid better wages than most garment shops. And the workers at Pacific Steel and those janitors that we're talking about all have unions. So their wages are actually higher. In fact, not only are they higher, but as the workers did at Pacific Steel, they had to go on strike in order to get those wages. So ICE is targeting the same set of employers, basically, that the Bush raids went after, and that is union companies, like Howard Industries, or ones that face organizing drives, like agro-processors, or in this case, Smithfield, the world's largest pork slaughterhouse in Tar Heel, North Carolina. So what ICE is doing is they are punishing undocumented workers who earn too much, or who become too visible by demanding higher wages and organizing unions. And despite the notion, according to ICE, that this kind of enforcement is going to punish employers who exploit immigrants, the reality is that American Apparel, APM, Pacific Steel, all these other companies, that employers who cooperate by dropping a dime on their own workers get immunized from prosecution. So the only people who suffer in this kind of enforcement are the workers themselves. So, what purpose does this serve? Again, well, we know one thing: it doesn't force people to leave the country. Remember the Cheech and Chong movie? The one that has everybody rushing across the freeway in San Diego to get into the United States? Probably all are, well, no, there's some people my age. You see any huge groups of people rushing back across the freeway to get back into Tijuana, Mexicali? You know, we are creating, first of all, this goes along with a lot of what you were talking about, Mario. We are creating a huge bureaucracy. We now have over 20,000 agents working for the Border Patrol, making it the second largest enforcement arm of the federal government after the FBI. Those so-called private detention centers, privately run detention centers, in other words, privately run prisons, run by corporations like Geo Corporation and Corrections Corporation of America. Well, last year, there were almost 400,000 people who spent at least some period of time in those prisons. We deported last year almost 400,000 people. We didn't. ICE did. The federal government did. I think we should be careful about using the word we, because who is the we here? You know, you didn't do it, I didn't do it, but the federal government did. This is the enforcement policy. But this is deeper than contracts and jobs. Michael Chertoff, you remember him? He was Bush's Secretary for Homeland Security. He said, there is an obvious solution to the problem of illegal work, which is you open the front door and you shut the back door. What we're talking about here is exactly what we saw in that slide about Operation Wetback. The same year that the U.S. deported, 1954, 1,075,000 people, the U.S. also brought in 450,000 braceros, or, as you say, people who were undocumented then became braceros. Same group of people. What Chertoff is talking about here, opening the front door, what it really means is letting contractors and corporations recruit people as workers in Mexico or Jamaica or Guatemala and give people visas that say you can only come here to work. And if you don't work, you have to leave. So people who come this way, they don't become citizens, they never have any political rights. Pretty convenient in Mississippi because Mississippi gets the labor of those people and they don't have to worry about upsetting Trent Lott and that political establishment there. And by no coincidence, Mississippi employs more guest workers, today's version of the braceros, per capita than any other state in the United States. So closing the back door, what that means is you can only come that way. You can only come if you're recruited by a contractor. So we militarize the border and threaten people who cross it with prison. There's a federal courtroom in Tucson called Operation Streamline where every day 100 young people go into that courtroom, and that federal courtroom in chains around their ankles and their waists and their wrists, and then they get sent to federal prison as punishment for crossing the border. Or we make it impossible to work if you haven't been recruited. That's what's going on with the firings and with the immigration raids in the workplace. You know, Mississippi, again, passed a state employer sanctions law a few years ago that said that if you are undocumented and you take a job in the state of Mississippi, any job, you are liable for a $10,000 fine and 5 years in the state prison. E-Verify, it's the same kind of solution. In other words, it's the same mechanism. In other words, what it is if you have no papers, it is an enforcement mechanism for making it a crime for you to work. So, one more. How many criminals like this are there? How many people are committing this crime of working in the United States today? How many do you think? What's your guess? CD clandestino. Cool people in the audience here, raise your hand. It's a music. It's a Manu Chao's a singer, and he sings about this. Clandestino is a CD. There's songs about this stuff, and so the song is about one of the songs on it is about people going from Morocco to Spain, or from Algeria to France, or from Jamaica to the UK, or from the Philippines to South Korea or to Japan. In other words, it's happening all over the world. There are 200 million people today in the world who are living outside the countries where they were born. So if we took all of those so-called illegal people and put them in one place, it would be 15 times the size of Los Angeles. A huge, huge, huge number of people. So, if all those people become criminals, they'll all go home, right?
Are they discriminating the person who wants to work or the employer as well?
Well, that's a very good question, because if you criminalize the employer for hiring, you are forcing the employer to fire the worker in order to obey the law, right? So you are criminalizing the work of the person. But you know, the idea, once you establish that idea, it spreads. That's what 1070, the Arizona law, is about. Or the ones that are even worse now. All of a sudden you're saying to teachers in school, you must determine what the legal status of the student is. Or the hospital emergency room, you must determine what the legal status of the person in the emergency room is. So, you know, you can say it's illegal for the emergency room to provide the care, but who suffers from the impact of that law? The emergency room in the hospital? No. The person is denied the care, right? Okay. So, since the North American Free Trade Agreement went into effect in 1994, well, in 1994, the number of Mexican citizens living in the United States was about 4.7 million. By 2010, the number was 13 million. 11% of the population of Mexico was here in the United States. So we have so many people that we have neighborhoods. Well, what's the name for what's the name here in the Central Valley for California? What do we call Madera and Merced and Fresno, right? What's the slang expression for it? Baja California, right? Oh. Right? What's the expression for New York? What do we call New York? Pueblo, York. You know, there are so many people now from Guatemala coming to Nebraska to work in the meatpacking plants that pretty soon I think Nebraska's going to be Nebraska-Mala. So it's, you know, it's recognizing, you know, this reality here. People are now coming from the most remote areas in Mexico, where people are speaking languages that were centuries, if not thousands of years old, before the Europeans got what this is saying is that the pressure for migration, the displacement of people, is so extensive in Mexico that it's reaching into every part of Mexico. There is nowhere you could go in Mexico where communities are not affected by the movement of people, the displacement of people. So why? Why so many people? Well, going back to NAFTA again, one thing that NAFTA did was it allowed U.S. corn companies or U.S. grain companies to sell corn in Mexico for a price that was lower than what it costs farmers in Mexico to grow it. So when we say U.S. grain companies, we could put some names on them. Archer Daniels Midland, Cargill, Continental Grain Company, these corporations. Now, the reason why they are able to do this, in part, is because they are subsidized by us. The last Farm Bill had $2 billion in subsidies for U.S. grain producers paid for by U.S. taxpayers. So those companies use those subsidies to lower their production costs, then dump the corn in Mexico in order to take over the market in Mexico, and at the same time, Mexican farmers, under the rules of NAFTA, were told that their government subsidies to them that helped to keep the price of corn high in Mexico so that people could afford to stay and farm it, that those subsidies were illegal and they were a restraint on competition that they had to end. So in other words, NAFTA's purpose was not to produce jobs, it was to create investment opportunities and then to protect investors. In Cananea, here, miners have been on strike now for 4 years to stop a huge multinational mining company, Grupo Mexico, which has U.S. investors, including the Sensenbrenner family, and we remember them because of the Sensenbrenner bill, from eliminating their jobs and busting their union. If the miners in Cananea, which is a tiny mining town in the mountains in Sonora, 50 miles south of the border with Arizona, if those miners lose that strike and then they lose their jobs, there's no other work in Cananea other than working in that mine. So, where do you think they'll go? If this was you, and it happened to you, and you lost your job, and you lost your union, what would you do? A year and a half ago, the Mexican government sent in the army to all the power plants in central Mexico, Mexico City and central Mexico, basically to destroy one of the most progressive unions in Mexico, the Mexican Electrical Workers Union. And that was a step towards essentially selling off the electrical grid in central Mexico to private investors, a big Spanish company, Unión Española. Where do you think, when those workers lost their jobs, when the government did that, 44,000 people in Mexico City, in central Mexico, lost their jobs because of that. What do you think is going to happen to those people? Where do you think they'll go? So, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the policies, the structural adjustment policies of our governments, the U.S. and the Mexican government both, they help big companies get rich by keeping wages low, by giving them subsidies, letting them push farmers into bankruptcy. But those are exactly the same reasons why it's so hard for people to survive. Because of those low wages, because people can't farm, because they get laid off to cut costs, because their factories get privatized or their unions get smashed. Now, Mexicans got some promises about NAFTA as well, too, when Carlos Salinas de Gortari was campaigning for it. And one of them was that free trade and that cheap corn would keep food prices low. Well, the price of tortillas in Mexico, 1994 to today, what happened? Did it go down? 3 times. It's 3 times what it was in 1994, which is wonderful if you are Grupo Maseca, which is Mexican tortilla monopoly, and by no accident, Archer Daniels Midland sits on the board of Grupo Maseca. And it's fine if you are the #1 retailer in Mexico, which is who? You read about them in the paper today.
Walmart.
Right, Walmart. We all know what they had to do to get those concessions to build those stores, right? But if you can't afford to buy those tortillas, then you go where you can. Now, same promises. They said that an economy that was based on maquiladoras, those factories along the border, and those low wages, supposedly to attract investment, would produce jobs in Juarez and Tijuana and Mexicali, and it did. But today, if you go to Tijuana, you find hundreds of thousands of people who have lost their jobs because when the recession began here, we stopped buying what those factories were producing. And when those factories could no longer sell what they were producing, what did they do to the workers there? They laid them off. Now the wages in the maquiladoras are so low that when people are working, you have to work half a day to buy a gallon of milk for your kids. And that's when you're working. So people are living in communities like this. You know, building houses from the cast saucer from the factories. People often don't have running water, no sewage system, and so on. So when people lose those jobs, let's go back to it. Yeah. So when people lose those jobs and the border is right there, well, the question really is, if this was you, if this is where you lived, and you lost your job, what would you do? And I don't think there's a single person here who can tell me you would not do whatever it takes for your family to survive. Because we all love our families. So if that's what your alternatives are, think about it. So these unequal trade agreements, and then we have repression and military intervention to support it. They don't stop the flow of migration, the flow of people. They produce it by displacing people, by making it impossible for people to survive without leaving home. And then our immigration laws regulate that flow of people. So migration isn't an accident, because the economic system here in this country depends on it. If everybody did go home tomorrow, those 12 or 13 million people without papers, another 26 million people who were born somewhere else and are either have a visa or become citizens here, if everybody did go home, what would happen? Who would cut up the cows and the pigs in those slaughterhouses? Who would pick the strawberries in Watsonville or the grapes here in Merced? I'm not saying that immigrants are the only people that work. We all work. We're all working people here. But we have to get real, and that is that the labor of immigrant people in this country is necessary for the economy here to survive. So, immigration enforcement, it doesn't keep people from crossing the border or prevent them from working. What it does do is it determines the status of people once they're here. It's about making people unequal, because inequality means lower wages and higher profits. So meanwhile, those structural adjustment policies, they tell countries like Mexico or the Philippines or Jamaica that they have to cut their government budget for social services in order to make those debt payments that Mario was talking about. So then, who pays for the costs of the communities that are sending workers north to the United States? Remittances, the money that's being sent home by people working here, pays for whatever social services people get in the towns that are sending people north. Here, migrant workers pay taxes, they get Social Security deducted from their paychecks like everybody else, but people don't get what the benefits that they're supposed to pay for. No disability, no retirement, no unemployment insurance. These are things that working people in this country fought for and won during the New Deal. But if you don't have any papers, it's like the New Deal just never happened to you. So an immigration policy, when we have an immigration policy that's based on producing a labor supply for employers, what we actually get are two things. So the first one is displacement. It becomes sort of the unspoken tool of that policy because that's what produces workers in other countries coming here. And then inequality becomes the official policy of this country. Today, if you talk about somebody and you call them illegal, you're not really talking about an illegal act. It's not the border that makes people illegal. It's the status of the person that's illegal. That's what justifies somebody's exclusion from the normal rights and social benefits that people have living in the community around them. And that status, that so-called illegal status, that's created here, not in Mexico, not on the border, but here. All the bills that we saw in Congress in the last 10 years, the immigration reform bills, they have an assumption that's so basic that we never even talk about it. And that is simply that even people with visas, immigrants, are not going to have the same set of rights and are not going to have the same social status as the people living in the communities around them. So, native born workers, one more, settled immigrant communities, people see the growth of an employment system in this country that's based on low wages and insecurity as a threat, because it is. It fosters competition among workers for jobs. And the part of the workforce with the lowest income and the fewest rights is the part that expands the fastest. So it's not hard for people to see the impact of this, even if they get very confused about what the reason for it is. But we don't have to assume that fear is hardwired into us or that we can't overcome it. You know, I like to think about what happened at Smithfield, at that huge pork slaughterhouse in Tar Heel, North Carolina. They had a union drive there that went on for 16 years. They had 2 immigration raids in which people went to federal prison for using those bad Social Security numbers. 300 people got fired. People got so scared because of that kind of enforcement that their union drive stopped. But then in that plant, which was about evenly divided between African Americans and Mexicans, people there found a way to make common cause, and eventually they brought the union in. And that common cause was when people were able to say to each other, we all need better wages and conditions, and we all have a right to work here and to fight for them. So today, we have to choose which way we want to go. There is a corporate agenda on migration, and that's what we hear in Washington from those lobbyists like the Council on Foreign Relations or from the employers' lobby who tell us what the parameters are of what's possible. But migrant workers are also fighters in this country. You know, some unions in this country, for instance, are growing, like the janitors union. And they're mostly the unions that know that migrant workers are willing to fight to make things better. Just because you don't have papers does not mean that you can't fight. In fact, we had a strike that shut down the housing construction industry from Santa Barbara to the Mexican border for an entire year in 1992. There was a strike that was organized by undocumented migrant workers working on residential construction sites. But we also need to remember a little bit of our history. So in 1964, the Merced program ended because Bert Corona and Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and Ernesto Galarza, they convinced Congress to repeal Public Law 78. That was the law that set up the system that basically made the Merced program possible. And once that program ended, what happened the year afterwards? 1965. We're in the valley here. This is our own history. What happened in 1965 here? That's right, the strike. The strike started. That was the birth of the United Farm Workers Union. People organized the union, went on a strike in Coachella. The strike spread up to Marvin, Lamont, Delano, Merced, all the way up the valley. The union was born. But then, let's go back one, I think. Yeah. In 1965, the year that the strike started, the same people we're talking about here, in other words, the leaders of the Chicano Civil Rights Movement, they went back to Congress, and they said essentially to Congress, give us a law, an immigration law, that does not make workers into Mercedes, that places the priority on our families and our communities. And that's how we won the family preference system. That's why, if you have a green card, you can get your mother or your father or your children to come and join you in the United States here. We didn't have that before. It was a civil rights movement that gave that to us. They didn't give it to us, we fought for it and won it. So, I know that we get very angry at that law now because the waits have gotten so long. You know, if you petition for your adult child living in Mexico City, well, the people who are coming now are the ones whose petitions were filed 18 years ago, or 22 years, you know. And if you file a petition today, the chances are you're going to wait a lot longer than that. So the system got starved for visas. You could say that this was a deliberate act by the same people who enforce and administer our immigration law, by Congress. But let's not forget what that system was designed to replace. Because that was designed to replace the Merced program, where the rule was to come to the United States if you are useful to the world. That fight is not over. In fact, I think that we have to fight harder about this stuff now than we've ever fought before. And just because we don't have an immigration bill in Congress right now, let's not fool ourselves. They're coming back as soon as the election's over. So we have to make sure, I think, also not just worry about 1070, not just worry about the Glenn Becks of the world, but also make sure that those people who say that they like immigrants are not actually in love with low wages. That they're not going to put our families in Mexico or El Salvador or the Philippines into poverty to get a new generation of workers to leave home, to go through the doors of furniture factories or out into the fields, or to help people take care of their gardens or take care of their children. So what is it that we do want then? Well, first of all, legalization. We need green cards for the people who don't have them, those 13 million people, so that people can live like normal people, not some kind of bullshit, pardon me, temporary worker status, but at least a legal status like Amica that gives you, some degree of rights and some ability to make decisions about your life. We need to get rid of the laws that turn people into criminals for working. That means repealing employer sanctions. That means getting rid of the criminalization of work, but more than just work. No more detention centers. Those privately run federal prisons for immigrants, we didn't have any 15 years ago. And now they're all over the place. But what we didn't have before, we can get rid of again. No more ankle bracelets, like we saw on those women from Postville. No more firings. So we need basically equality and rights. Not a visa that says that if somebody's fired or if they lose their job, they have to leave the country. Everybody. So everybody in our community needs to have the same rights and have the same status here. And of course, the most important thing is that people have to be able to organize. That's the net, because you don't get justice in our country, in our world, by simply waiting for it. You have to organize for it. And so we have to make sure that those laws that stand in the way of people organizing, like employer sanctions, for instance, that say you're a criminal if you work. Imagine what the effect is on somebody if, there's a union drive in your plant and somebody gives you a card saying join the union, and then you think to yourself, wait a minute, if I lose my job here, how am I going to find another one with E-Verify out there? We have to get rid of the things that stand as barriers in the way of people organizing, the raids and the enforcement. But also people's families in Mexico or Guatemala or El Salvador or the Philippines, they deserve a decent life too. People have a right to survive. Young people growing up in Oaxaca have a right to not migrate. That's what people are debating about in Oaxaca today, because they knocked the PRI out in Oaxaca, finally, 70 years. And they have a supposedly progressive governor, a supposedly progressive government there, and now Rufino Dominguez, who used to be the coordinator of the Frente Indígena down in Fresno, is the head of the Oaxacan Institute for Attention to Migrants, which is an organ of the state government. And what Oaxaca is talking about today is the right to not migrate. What changes have to happen in Oaxaca so that migration becomes voluntary rather than something you get forced into because you have no alternative to it? So what are you talking about? It's not rocket science. You're talking about jobs. You're talking about schools, productive farms, prices that are high enough so that you can afford to stay on your land, health care for people, and political rights too, so that we don't have what happened in 2006 in Oaxaca when people went on strike, teachers went on strike, and everything mushroomed because people were sick and tired of being the state in Mexico that was sending the most migrants to the United States per capita because there was no other alternative for young people there. People need the ability to advocate for the kind of political changes they want. But to get that, we have to do some things in this country as well, too. We have to, first of all, end the use of this free trade system as a means of creating displacement of people. That is possible for some people, but it's devastating for the rest of us. And if people do choose to come here to work, then people deserve the same rights as anybody else. We don't want to have a two-tier society where only some people can walk the streets or drive their cars without fear. So, this is possible. This is just some sort of pipe dream for vision possible. Well, first of all, there are groups that are calling for legislation that is based on these ideas, and one of them is called the Dignity Campaign. And I brought two documents here. One is a list of the proposals that are part of this, and the other one is sort of an invitation letter and a list of the organizations that are supporting it. So why don't we start this one going here, this one going there, and then take it, pass it on. And basically what this is calling for is an immigration reform that is based on human and labor rights rather than based on the labor supply. But it's not possible to win changes in migration policy just by itself. You know, we need jobs, for instance, in this country as well, too. We need education, we need health care, we need a justice system that doesn't target our young people. All of these things are connected to immigration and to the rights of migrants. But these are also things that everybody in our country needs. And if we fight together, we can create a more just society for everybody, regardless of people's status, immigrant or not immigrant alike. So again, this is possible. Se puede. I think basically the lesson of the civil rights movement is that if we want change, we have to have a movement to get it. But I believe that we can have an immigration system that respects human rights. We can win things. We can protect the jobs of people who are being fired and stop the firings. We can't stop those detention centers. You know, we can't stop the deportations. And if they tell us that it's not possible, well, what do we do? What do we say? And they say, no se puede. We say, sí se puede. Sí se puede. Sí se puede.
Thank you very much. What we thought we'd do is we want to always have some chance for questions or comments. And so if you have questions for Mario Cifuentes or David, we're going to save a little bit of time here. Questions or comments for our first two speakers?
This question is for David Bacon. The Dual Institute, what's the name of it? My mind went blank in a moment. I was talking to Robin. We just did a study recently where they said that undocumented people are returned to their country, mainly Mexico. How accurate do you think that study is?
Yeah, I read that too, and I'm sure you.
Yeah, no, I think most studies have said since 2007 the immigration's been net zero. So yeah, it's slowing down.
And what's the reason they're returning back to their own country?
It's not working.
But you know, the flip side of that, though, is, you know, in Oaxaca, for instance, and in Toluca, you know, the state governments of both of those states, when the recession began here, they began, and especially when they saw the, you know, Arizona law and so forth, they began sort of saying, well, we have to get prepared for the flood of people coming back. But the flood didn't get there. In other words, the same things that sent people to the United States to begin with, things haven't changed in Mexico. You know, the standard of living in Mexico has not gone up. The unemployment rate hasn't gone down. You know, the same basic reasons for people coming here haven't changed. So, you know, I think that you know, you get some up and down movement because of the boom and bust cycle in our economy on this side of the border here. But without really dealing with the basic root causes, in other words, with the way in which the U.S. intervenes in the Mexican economy, both to protect the profits of corporations, but to be honest, to also produce workers. I think that it's still going to go to a long term.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Here, let's get you a microphone. So everybody can hear your good question.
Can you kind of like explain the picture you just passed out? Like, give us like.
Explain what it is?
Yeah, like, and
Well, the origin of this proposal is basically that grassroots, many grassroots immigrant rights groups around the country did not like the bills that were on the table in Washington over the last 10 years. Because basically, immigration reform bills of the last 10 years, what are called comprehensive immigration reform. We're basically like IRCA. We're basically like the law in '86, which was guest workers and then enforcement in order to force people into guest worker programs, and then legalization used as kind of a carrot to get us to buy into it. And so many people oppose that trade-off and have been talking since then about what kind of bill do we want that reflects our own needs. In other words, what kind of proposals do we want to make for changes in U.S. immigration policy that would actually help our communities rather than seeing it as a question of what do we have to give to employers or what do we have to give to the Republicans in order to get something from them. And so that's what the Dignity Campaign proposal is. The idea is, let's talk about what we actually want, and let's talk about what we actually think is going to resolve our problems rather than make them worse. So what it does is it says, for instance, we have to change the trade policy so that we stop producing poverty and displacement in other countries and military intervention. We need to decriminalize work, repeal employer sanctions, repeal the other parts of our laws now that criminalize status and that criminalize people's work. We need to repeal those sections of immigration law that have set up the new Merced program. So we have H-2A, we have H-2B, we have H-1B, which are all guest worker programs, and today bring as many as 250,000 people to the United States under these guest worker programs. We need to enforce people's labor rights. We need to demilitarize the border and protect instead the civil rights of people living in border communities. So those are the basic ideas in the proposal. If you look at the bullet points, which is the other document there, you can see it fleshed out a little bit.
And I really appreciated the program. I think it's been excellent. I wanted to make one comment. There was a reference to our youth in this country, and Democracy Now! Just had recently showed a clip of a man being beaten to death and tasered to death. An immigrant, father of 5 kids, U.S. born from San Diego. And this was aired on Democracy Now! And it's very disturbing because, just not too long ago, this young man, African American in Florida, was also killed, Trayvon Martin. And there are many more hate crimes that are occurring now. I mean, in San Diego, a mother of 5 children, Iraqi, was killed because she's Iraqi, for example. So this is a really hostile environment. I think the thing about tearing down the walls of ignorance is very important because right now with the high unemployment and economic problems that we're seeing, they're looking for somebody to blame, just like was mentioned by Mr. Cifuentes during the Great Depression. Just wanted to make one little comment. I'd like to hear what you say, but there's a paper, Tribuna del Pueblo, that has articles on the Trayvon Martin issue, and then the Community Alliance has some articles by young people from Fresno around the DREAM Act and issues around making millionaires, for example, pay for some of the problems that California is having. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Francisco?
Yeah, here in a lot of places, there's a lot of immigration, a lot of people coming over the border because of NAFTA. But wasn't there already some immigration before NAFTA? And does that have to do with the American dream, in quotes? And also another question is, so it's because of the economy, right? So if Canada was doing better than us here, we would all go over there, right?
So I think, yeah, I mean, in the immigration and numbers of immigrants that come here are always sort of skewed, right? So
A couple of things that, historically speaking, that I forgot to talk about and I wanted to add to what David was saying is in 1926, the United States passed the Johnson-Reed Act. And the Johnson-Reed Act was one of the first major immigration acts that ever existed. What that did was limit the number of people that could come from particular countries to the United States. And so the United States always envisions itself as a white country. So it created what they called the Asiatic Barred Zone. And so nobody from Asian countries could immigrate to the United States after 1924. First it was the Chinese in 1892, then it was the Japanese, the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan in 1904, and then by 1924, the United States had barred all Asians from coming, and barred all Africans from coming. And the one country that was excluded from that was Mexico. So Mexico was excluded from the quotas. And Mexico could allow, was still able to migrate, Mexicans were still able to migrate to the United States in the 1920s. Basically because the farmers needed them. So farmers said, no, you can't bar Mexicans from coming. So while the 1965 Act was good and that it created the Family Reunification Act, it also placed a quota on Mexico for the first time. And so Mexicans have been coming to the United States legally up until 1965. I mean, undocumented and documented until 1965. In 1965, put a quota on immigrants, on Mexican immigrants at 120,000. And there were already 400 or 500,000 immigrants in the United States. So overnight, you had 480,000 undocumented immigrants, like literally overnight. So while yes, the 65, the Hart-Celler Act of 65 opened up the immigration possibilities for people from Asia, people from Africa. The family reunification was a major component of that. It was, I think, an unforeseen component. People didn't expect that many people of color to migrate over. But it had a negative effect on Mexican immigration. It turned a whole bunch of Mexicans into undocumented immigrants. So yes, people have always been coming. But once Mexico's economy starts to falter in the 70s, is when you see a huge jump from 500,000 to 1 million. And then by 1994, from 4 million to 13 million that we have now. So yes, people have always come, but as the situation deteriorates, and NAFTA exacerbated the economic situation in Mexico that created more migration. And now, with these free trade agreements, we just signed one in Colombia a few weeks ago, and all we heard about was the Secret Service prostitution scandal, and not about the free trade agreement, which is going to start sending Colombian immigrants out of the country. When we sign one with Brazil, which we've been pushing for a while, the Central American free trade agreement, like free trade agreements are going to make people move. It's just what happened. Like that's just historically what's happening. Will always happen.
And the NAFTA, it's true what you're saying that there was migration, obviously before NAFTA, and the same economic forces on people that were pushing people to come to the United States existed before the agreement. So the agreement kind of exacerbated it and made it worse, but the movement was already there. Another good example of it is the cutoff date for the amnesty. Now you talked about the peso shock, which was 1982. Remember, what was the cutoff date for the amnesty? Was January 1st, 1982, which meant that all of the people who were coming to the United States as a result of the peso shock had to come without papers. Now, they wrote the law in '86, so the peso shock had already happened 4 years before. So you think they didn't know that by putting the date there, that essentially that it would make illegal or undocumented those people who had already come as a result of the peso shock, who would not be eligible for the amnesty? The economy not only needs labor in general, but employers want labor under certain conditions. In other words, cheap. In other words, vulnerable. People who can be forced into doing the dirty jobs or doing the jobs that pay the least or that have the least security, or where you wind up working for a contractor instead of an employer, all those things. Because all those things are growing at the same year, at the same time as the flow of migration is coming as well too. So, it's not something that happens, it's not like migration happens over here and the rest of the economy happens over here. The fact that we have an economy where it used to be that only growers and garment companies use contractors. Now, janitorial companies, there's contractors everywhere. I used to work in an electronics plant when I worked there in the late 70s, there were 10,000 people there, and we all worked directly for the company, National Semiconductor. If you go there now, their manpower has an office in the company, and 6,000 of those people are working for a temp agency. And like you were talking about the same people often. They just stopped being direct employees at $15 an hour and became contract employees without a medical plan at $8 or $9 an hour. And so the migration of people and the fact that people come here without rights helps that system to grow.
I want to add too that the IRCA, the 1986 amnesty we were talking about. 6 million people received amnesty through IRCA. 4 million of them received it through what's called SAL, the Special Agricultural Workers Program. So most people, they asked these people to provide documentation that they were in the country, that they had, that they had been here continuously. And when you ask undocumented people to provide documents, that makes it incredibly difficult to prove that you've been in the country continuously. So most people got their amnesty through what they call the Special Agricultural Workers Provision. Now, the SAW provision was implemented or put into the IRCA amnesty because of farmers, because farmers were worried that if 6 million people got amnesty, they wouldn't have anybody to work in their fields. And so the SAW then gave preferential treatment to those people working in the fields, right, to be able to get amnesty. And in many ways, what the farmers were worried about came true. Once people had amnesty, they had citizenship, they went to go work in other professions that paid them well, they got better jobs. And in many ways, while amnesty gave those people, while the IRCA gave those people amnesty, it also created the need for more undocumented immigrants. Because now that people had rights and had labor rights and had citizenship rights, the farmers then turned away again to go look for more undocumented.
I mean, sometimes it's even more direct than just general. I mean, if you look at the Social Security system, you have millions of people paying money into the Social Security fund who cannot collect benefits on the money that's being paid in. So, the surplus fund of the social, or the estimations of, how much money that is in the billions of dollars. I mean, the last figure I heard was $56 billion in the Social Security fund that was coming in because of that. So, it's not just in the future, but anybody today that is collecting a retirement check or collecting on SDI is collecting a little piece of the money that's being paid in. I think, though, that we have to be careful about that argument, though, because on the one hand, I think we ought to recognize the reality of what's true, that undocumented people are contributing to this economy, not taking away. And that's, one example of it. But I think also that we don't want to make an argument for low wages or bad conditions, that the people who are here in this country, contributing economically, also deserve rights and deserve decent wages that are capable of supporting families. And just because growers and employers want them at a certain wage level doesn't mean that we should, basically accept those arguments. You hear, for instance, that a common employer argument, for instance, like strawberry growers is, well, if you raise the wages of strawberry workers by giving everybody green cards, say, instead of guest worker visas, that the price of strawberries in the market is going to double. Or, in other words, the price of goods is going to increase because workers' wages increase. And first of all, that's an argument against people being able to make a decent living and support their families. But it's also a false argument, because the reality is that the amount of money going to the person picking the strawberries of the price that you're paying, like that $2 basket that you're paying in the supermarket, the amount of money that actually goes down the line and goes into the pocket of the person who picked the strawberries there is less than 10% of it. So you could easily double the wages of somebody working in the fields, and you wouldn't notice the difference in the prices in the supermarket, because the price of a basket of strawberries goes up and down so much anyway that an extra 10 cents on the price of the basket is not something that you would even see. So, yes, the labor of people is, and the other part of it too is that there's also the argument that gets made in Washington, especially by the lobbyists, who say, well, immigrants are doing the jobs that nobody else wants to do, which is another kind of low-wage argument. And I think that the reality is that, first of all, we all work. Everybody needs to work. Everybody needs a job. We all need decent wages for it. And we don't want to create a sort of special class of people whose economic function in our society is to work at low wages, and therefore we ought to feel sorry for them in some way.